The comment was loud enough for everyone at the briefing table to hear, and the room went silent. "Look at those Canadian amateurs trying to plan an amphibious assault. They've been sitting in England playing soldier for 4 years while we've been actually fighting. Maybe we should show them how a real army conducts operations." Colonel Robert Hargrove immediately regretted saying it, not because he thought he was wrong, but because he had said it in a joint planning session where Canadian liaison officers were sitting across the table. The Canadian major, who had been mid-briefing, a man named MacDonald, stopped speaking and looked at Hargrove with an expression that carried more disappointment than anger. It was early May 1944, somewhere in southern England, during one of the dozens of planning sessions preparing for the Normandy invasion. American and Canadian forces were coordinating their assault plans, working to ensure that neighboring beaches would be mutually supporting and that the two forces could link up effectively once they were ashore. Hargrove commanded a regiment in the 4th Infantry Division that would be hitting Juno Beach. He had fought in North Africa and had strong opinions about American military capability built on that experience. In his view, forces that had spent years in garrison in England, regardless of how long they had been training, simply could not match forces that had been through actual combat. What Hargrove did not know, and had not bothered to find out, was that the Canadian major he had just dismissed had fought in Sicily and Italy with the 1st Canadian Division before being assigned to help plan the 3rd Canadian Division's assault on Juno Beach. MacDonald had more recent combat experience than Hargrove did, but Hargrove had made his judgment based on nationality, not on the man in front of him, and that judgment had led him somewhere professionally embarrassing. The British colonel chairing the meeting intervened with the patience of a man who had watched this kind of friction before. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should focus on the operational planning. Major MacDonald, please continue." MacDonald resumed his briefing. The damage was done anyway. The comment and the attitude it represented would be remembered. And over the weeks that followed, during the invasion itself, and through the brutal fighting that came after, that comment and everything behind it would be proven wrong in ways that would sit uncomfortably with American commanders who had shared Hargrove's assumptions. The roots of American underestimation of Canadian forces ran deeper than one colonel's careless remark. American military culture in 1944 was riding the momentum of genuine victories in North Africa and the Pacific. American soldiers and officers had real grounds for confidence. They were backed by industrial output that dwarfed anything any other nation could produce, and they had demonstrated that American forces could defeat Axis opponents in the field. This confidence had curdled in some quarters into something less defensible: the assumption that the United States fielded not just capable forces, but inherently superior ones, and that forces from smaller allied nations were well-meaning, but operating at a lower level. In this worldview, Canadian forces were colonial troops from a country that lacked America's population, industrial scale, and battlefield record. The fact that Canada had been at war since September 1939, more than 2 years before Pearl Harbor, was acknowledged but not weighted heavily. The fact that Canadian forces had been training specifically for the Normandy operation far longer than any American unit was noted, but dismissed as garrison time rather than genuine preparation. When American officers joked among themselves about Canadians playing soldier while real armies fought, There was enough genuine belief behind it to make those jokes land differently than ordinary inter-service ribbing. These attitudes showed up throughout the planning process for D-Day. Some American planners argued that Canadian forces should receive less ambitious objectives, that their ability to execute complex operations against heavily fortified positions was unproven. Canadian planners argued back, insisting their forces were capable of demanding missions and should be assigned objectives commensurate with their training and preparation. The compromise that emerged assigned Canadian forces to Juno Beach with objectives that were among the most ambitious of any Allied assault force: penetrate approximately 10 kilometers inland, link up with British forces on both flanks, secure key transportation routes. These were aggressive targets, and they assumed a rapid breakthrough of German defenses followed by a sustained advance throughout the day. Some American officers privately questioned whether Canadians could pull it off. Hargrove's comment captured the prevailing attitude plainly enough, but he was not alone in it. His view of the situation was one most American officers shared to varying degrees. The specific planning disagreements between American and Canadian officers reflected deeper differences in how the two forces approached military operations. Americans tended to emphasize firepower and material superiority. The conviction that superior equipment and industrial advantage would solve tactical problems that insufficient preparation would otherwise cause. Canadian doctrine, shaped by British tradition but adapted through Canadian combat experience, placed heavier emphasis on preparation, detailed coordination, and organizational discipline before operations began. These different approaches generated real friction. American officers would propose aggressive plans built on the assumption that American materiel advantages would overwhelm whatever resistance they encountered. Canadian officers would press on whether adequate preparation had been done to ensure those plans could actually be executed. Americans would read Canadian caution as timidity. Canadians would read American confidence as planning shortcuts. After the meeting where Hargrove had made his remark, MacDonald spoke with his Canadian colleagues. The Americans assume that because we're a smaller country, we must be less capable militarily, he said. They don't understand that we've been preparing for this specific invasion for years. Not general combat training, but the particular challenges we'll face at Normandy. They think combat experience in North Africa automatically makes them better prepared than we are, even though North African operations have almost nothing in common with an amphibious assault against fortified positions in Northwest Europe. Captain Thompson, who had also served in Italy, added a sharper observation. The irony is that some of us have more recent combat experience than American officers who fought in North Africa 2 years ago. But because we're Canadian, they assume we're inexperienced, regardless of our actual service records. All we can do is execute our operations and let the results speak. That became the Canadian position. Stop trying to convince skeptical American officers through argument and let combat performance make the case. Canadian officers refocused on preparation, knowing that what happened on the day would be more persuasive than anything said before it. D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944. The assaults across all 5 beaches began around 6:30 in the morning, following overnight airborne operations and an extensive naval bombardment. The early reports reaching Allied headquarters were fragmentary and confused in the way that battlefield reporting always is in the first hours of a major operation. But by mid-morning, patterns were becoming visible. American forces at Omaha Beach were in serious trouble. They were pinned down under fire that was heavier and more accurate than the planning had prepared for. Casualties in the first waves were catastrophic, and for a period, the situation was desperate enough that Allied commanders considered abandoning the Omaha assault and redirecting follow-on forces elsewhere. American forces at Utah Beach were making better progress, but were still fighting hard for every meter of ground. The German defenses were less formidable than at Omaha, but they were still substantial, and the advance was slower than the pre-invasion planning had assumed. At Juno Beach, the Canadian assault had hit terrible conditions in its first minutes. The landing tide was wrong, placing troops among German obstacles that inflicted severe casualties on landing craft before soldiers even reached the shore. German defensive fire from bunkers and fortified positions was intense and well targeted. The first waves of the 3rd Canadian Division took casualties that by any conventional measure should have disrupted the assault's momentum. They didn't disrupt it. Canadian forces pushed through the obstacles using specialized armor and engineer teams that had been prepared specifically for this problem. They suppressed German defensive positions methodically, using naval gunfire directed by forward observers embedded with the assault troops. They maintained offensive pressure despite losses that would have caused many forces to consolidate and wait for the situation to stabilize. The German defensive doctrine assumed that attacking forces would pause after taking heavy casualties, creating windows for reserves to counterattack. Canadian forces didn't pause in the patterns the defenders expected. By noon, headquarters maps showed Canadian penetrations inland that exceeded progress at any other beach. The 3rd Canadian Division was through the German defensive lines and pushing toward deeper objectives. Some Canadian units were already more than 5 kilometers inland, while American forces at Utah Beach were still consolidating within 2 kilometers of the water. General Omar Bradley read the situation reports showing Canadian progress with a reaction that combined relief. The invasion as a whole was succeeding with something less comfortable. Forces that American officers had dismissed as amateurs were outperforming veteran American divisions on one of the most demanding days in the history of warfare. Bradley requested a comprehensive assessment of Canadian D-Day operations. He wanted to understand how this had happened. The analysis, compiled as more detailed after-action reports became available over the following days, was difficult reading for American commanders who had underestimated Canadian capabilities. Canadian forces had suffered approximately 1,000 casualties, significant losses reflecting the severity of the German defenses at Juno. But they had inflicted substantially heavier losses on the defenders, captured all assigned beach objectives by early afternoon, and established inland penetrations averaging 7 to 9 kilometers by end of day. Against strong opposition with significant casualties in the initial assault, they had accomplished everything they had been assigned, and then some. The analysis attributed this to several specific factors. Canadian artillery coordination had been exceptional throughout the assault. Naval gunfire was responsive and accurate at critical moments because Canadian forward observers embedded with the leading troops were directing it effectively under fire. Canadian combined arms procedures had functioned as trained armor, infantry, and engineers working together to breach obstacles and suppress defensive positions in sequences that required both preparation and discipline to execute correctly under the conditions they faced. Critically, Canadian junior leadership had shown the initiative to adapt when situations diverged from planning assumptions. When communications broke down or German resistance was stronger than anticipated, Canadian sergeants and lieutenants made tactical decisions independently rather than waiting for direction from higher command. This kept the offensive moving even when command and control was degraded by combat. The analysis noted explicitly that this quality, the ability of junior leaders to exercise judgment under pressure, had been a significant factor in maintaining the momentum that defined Canadian D-Day performance. The document concluded with observations that were pointed in their implications. Canadian performance on D-Day had exceeded that of American forces at both Utah and Omaha in terms of inland penetration and objective accomplishment. This result stemmed from specialized preparation for Normandy operations conducted over multiple years. Preparation that had developed institutional expertise in amphibious assault and close country fighting. That American forces, despite general combat experience from other theaters, had not developed to the same degree. Bradley convened his senior staff to discuss what the analysis meant. "Gentlemen, we need to recalibrate our assessment of Canadian capabilities," he opened. "D-Day makes clear that our prior assumptions were incorrect. We need to understand how we got this wrong and what it means going forward." One of his division commanders offered a diagnosis. "We confused combat experience with operational readiness, sir. We assumed that fighting in North Africa made us better prepared for Normandy than Canadian forces who had been training in England. But preparation for a specific operation matters more than general combat experience. The Canadians prepared specifically for what they had to do. We prepared generally for combat. That difference showed in the results. Bradley accepted this. We also allowed national pride to cloud our judgment. We wanted to believe American forces were superior, so we discounted evidence that Canadian forces were genuinely well prepared. That's a professional failing that needs to be corrected." Another officer added the harder problem: the dismissiveness before D-Day may have damaged coalition relationships. Canadian commanders know we question their capabilities. Rebuilding that trust means demonstrating respect now and acknowledging that our initial assessments were wrong. The meeting ran for hours as American commanders worked through the operational and coalition implications of having gotten Canadian capabilities so badly wrong. Meanwhile, Canadian commanders were having their own conversations about what the experience had revealed. MacDonald spoke with Major General Rod Keller, the 3rd Canadian Division Commander. "The Americans are starting to recognize that we're not amateurs. D-Day forced a reassessment, but it's unfortunate that we had to prove ourselves in combat before they would take us seriously. Professional respect should be based on observed preparation, not just on results achieved under fire." Keller was philosophical about it. American military culture is confident, sometimes to the point of arrogance. Challenging that confidence requires demonstrated performance, which is what we provided on D-Day. They will adjust based on what they observe. We continue operating professionally and let the results do the work. As the Normandy campaign continued, American and Canadian forces operated in adjacent sectors and had repeated opportunities to observe each other directly. Those observations generally reinforced what D-Day had established. Through June and July, Canadian forces around Caen were engaged in brutal fighting against German SS panzer divisions. The casualty figures were severe, and the territorial gains were measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers, which led some American officers unfamiliar with the operational logic to question Canadian effectiveness. Hargrove, whose regiment was operating to the west, heard reports about heavy Canadian losses around Caen and made comments to his staff that reflected his old assumptions still reasserting themselves, suggesting Canadian forces were taking these casualties because they didn't understand armored warfare. Captain Morrison, one of his company commanders, pushed back directly. "Sir, with respect, the Canadians at Caen are doing exactly what the operational plan requires. They're holding the German armor in place so that our forces can exploit to the west with less opposition. They're absorbing the weight of the panzer divisions deliberately. We should recognize what they're accomplishing, not question their tactics." Hargrove was initially defensive. He came around. Morrison's willingness to challenge his colonel's assumption reflected a broader shift happening among American officers who were paying close attention to what was actually happening rather than relying on prior judgments. This pattern, junior American officers developing accurate assessments of Canadian capabilities while some senior officers maintained older attitudes, created real tension within American command structures. Officers working directly alongside Canadian units saw what those units could do. Officers relying on preconceptions sometimes did not update them. Private James Thompson, a rifleman in Hargrove's regiment, wrote home to his family in Texas in July 1944. "I met some Canadian soldiers yesterday, and we talked about the fighting. These guys have been in combat since D-Day just like us, and they've seen rough fighting. They're professional soldiers who know what they're doing. Before the invasion, we used to joke about Canadians being amateurs. I've watched them fight now. They're just as good as we are, maybe better in some ways. Their artillery support is faster and more accurate than ours, and their junior officers seem to have more authority to make decisions without checking upward. I don't make those jokes anymore." Major Edward Collins, an American artillery officer serving as liaison with a Canadian division, sent formal reports to his superiors that were equally direct. "Canadian artillery procedures are among the best I have observed in any Allied force. Their forward observers are exceptionally well trained and effectively integrated with infantry operations. Their fire control centers can mass fire from multiple batteries on priority targets within minutes. American artillery units could learn valuable lessons from studying Canadian methods. The operational consequences of the earlier underestimation surfaced in specific, concrete ways beyond the general embarrassment of D-Day. In late June, a coordinated advance called for American forces on the left and Canadian forces on the right to move simultaneously. American planning had built-in assumptions about Canadian advance rates based on outdated assessments. The plan expected Canadians to move more slowly and assigned them accordingly to a flank security role while American forces executed the main exploitation. When the operation was executed, Canadian forces reached their objectives ahead of the schedule American planning had assumed. They were positioned to exploit further when American forces were not yet ready to support them. An opportunity to break through German defenses more completely was missed because the American plan had not accounted for what Canadian forces could actually do. After the operation, the American commander involved acknowledged it plainly. We planned for Canadians to be slower than they were. This was our mistake, based on not updating our assessment after D-Day proved they were highly effective. Future operations need to be planned against realistic appraisals, rather than against assumptions that evidence has already disproven. The same friction appeared in diplomatic channels. Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King was acutely sensitive to how Canadian forces were being perceived and treated by their allies. He insisted on recognition for Canadian contributions and on Canadian commanders being consulted as genuine equals in strategic planning. American dismissiveness made these demands harder to satisfy and generated exchanges between governments that became pointed at times. American officials would point to America's larger contribution in total forces and material support as grounds for American leadership of coalition planning. Canadian officials would point to the length of Canada's commitment at war since 1939 and to demonstrated combat performance as grounds for equal partnership regardless of national size. These tensions were eventually resolved through Canadian performance that made dismissiveness untenable, and through American leaders, Bradley prominent among them, who recognized that coalition warfare required treating capable partners as equals. But reaching that resolution required overcoming the initial underestimation through repeated Canadian success in operations that had been difficult. By August 1944, as the campaign culminated in the Falaise Gap operation that encircled and destroyed two German armies, the shift in American attitudes was visible in how planning and coordination actually worked. Canadian forces bore responsibility for closing the northern shoulder of the gap against desperate German attempts to break out, a demanding mission under severe pressure. American commanders coordinating with Canadian forces treated them as competent equals. Planning was genuinely collaborative. When Canadian forces needed support, the American response was to provide it, not to question whether the need reflected a competence failure. Hargrove, not directly involved in the Falaise fighting but aware of what Canadian forces were accomplishing there, sought out MacDonald during a coordination conference in late August. "Major, I owe you more than the quick acknowledgment I offered after D-Day. My comment about Canadian amateurs was wrong in every particular, based on assumption rather than assessment, and it reflected poorly on me and on American professionalism. Your forces have demonstrated repeatedly that they're among the best Allied troops in this theater. I should have recognized that through your evident preparation before the invasion, rather than requiring combat results to convince me." MacDonald received the apology with composure. "Colonel, the issue was never personal to me. The problem was that your attitude, which was widely shared among American officers, prevented the kind of effective coalition coordination that operations require. Professional military forces need to assess each other accurately to work together well. That assessment should be based on observed capability, not national assumptions." He paused. "What matters now is that American and Canadian forces have developed genuine mutual respect through shared combat. We understand each other's capabilities and can function as professional partners. That's what coalition warfare requires. We've achieved it, even if the start was rougher than it needed to be." The lesson embedded in that exchange extended well beyond Hargrove and MacDonald. Coalition warfare is not simply the sum of the forces involved. It is the product of how well those forces understand each other, how accurately each partner assesses the other's capabilities, how much each respects the other's professional judgment, and how effectively they can plan and coordinate in conditions where miscommunication has consequences measured in lives and missed opportunities. The American underestimation of Canadian forces before Normandy created real operational costs. Planning that didn't account for Canadian capabilities, coordination failures where assumptions about Canadian pace didn't match Canadian performance, and diplomatic friction that consumed energy and goodwill that could have gone elsewhere. None of these individual failures was catastrophic, but they were all avoidable. What corrected them was not argument. It was performance, the sustained, documented, repeatedly confirmed fact of Canadian forces doing exactly what needed to be done under conditions that would have tested any army, beginning with the morning of June 6th on Juno Beach. The 3rd Canadian Division landed in the wrong tidal conditions, among German obstacles that inflicted significant casualties before the fighting even started, against defenders who had prepared extensively for exactly this kind of assault. They pushed through anyway. By noon, they were farther inland than any other Allied force on D-Day. They accomplished every objective assigned to them and positioned themselves to advance farther when the operational plan caught up. Hargrove's comment, "Look at those Canadian amateurs," is remembered because it stated plainly what many officers believed and few said aloud. What is equally worth remembering is what happened next. Canadian forces went out and demonstrated in the clearest possible terms that the assumption behind the comment was simply wrong. That demonstration changed how American commanders planned, how they coordinated, and how they thought about the Canadian forces fighting beside them. It was an expensive way to correct a mistake that careful observation and accurate professional assessment could have prevented.